Welcome back to A Unity Dev Learns Godot, where there's no rules and the changes don't matter. In today's episode, we find out how many times I can remake the same feature as I struggle to not crumble under the weight of embarrassment at not being literally the smartest person to ever exist. I'll be honest with you guys, there isn't a whole lot of actual progress that was made in this episode, even though I spent like 4 times longer actually working in Godot for this episode than the last one. This really comes down to the fact that I had to get serious about learning things like project architecture, code style, and other technical stuff. At first, I tried implementing all these things on my own, which if you recall I said I like to do. But I learned I should only do that once I'm familiar enough with the environment I'm working in, because that really came back to bite me this time. Honestly though, a lot of the reasons I did try doing things my own way was that I didn't know the right questions to ask to get the help for what I wanted to do. Fortunately, I had some very helpful commenters who offered me great advice that got me going in the right direction. Okay, with that explanation out of the way, let's get into the episode. At the end of the last episode, I had these generic creatures represented by rats. I figured I'd ease myself into working on this episode by creating a dedicated sprite for them. So I made these ghost things. Aren't they cute? I then proceeded to do a lot of things that I threw away later, which I won't bother you with. But in the process, I discovered how to view the scene as it is while the game is running. This allows me to check things like targets, animation states, health, etc., and is really handy. Obviously, it's not as good as Unity, where I can see everything that's happening in the game from the editor as well, but it's a start for Godot, and better to have than not. After that, I wanted to enable creatures to use weapons as well. My idea was to be able to have special enemies that have different attack abilities than usual, like a flamethrower, or poison gas, or maybe even... I figured I could streamline the process of doing that by having any kind of attack actually come from a weapon that either the player or creature held and used, instead of it being intrinsic to them. This way I can easily set up these special enemies and also potentially enable some fun randomization. It was really difficult to retrofit this onto the creatures because I hadn't initially designed the weapons to be used by anyone but the player. Also, I had no idea what I was doing in the first place, so there's that obstacle too. Eventually though, I did manage to redesign the weapons to be usable by both the player and the creatures. I use a weapon socket component that accepts a weapon object. Each weapon socket inherits from the master weapon socket object. There are 2 versions, one for a player and one for an NPC. It works pretty well for now, and it should be easier to rework as I need later. I learned a lot of cool things about GDScript this episode, the first of which while I was working on the weapons and their sockets. There's a keyword, @export, for variants, as I'm told var stands for non-variable. It lets me assign references in the editor like Unity, which I should have expected was something I could do, but for some reason never looked up how. I'm glad to have learned about it though, because it makes some things much easier. At the end of the last episode, I had these generic creatures represented by ghosts. I figured I'd ease myself into working on this episode by creating a different sprite for them.
Oh, déjà vu.
So I made them into giant balls, because it's fun to play with balls.
Right, stop that. Silly. And a bit suspect, I think.
As I mentioned in the last episode, a helpful commenter suggested I use 2D lighting to switch up the mood of a level. So I tried that out. It's very cool, and I'm impressed with how easy it was to get it implemented. It basically took no time and immediately made the level feel more atmospheric and creepy. After that, I needed different kinds of attacking animations for weapons, so I made some for stabbing, slashing, and biting, in addition to the large sweeping animation I was using before. I briefly attempted to make use of Godot's resources, which are basically like scriptable objects in Unity, but the tutorial I was using wasn't very good and I couldn't figure them out. I do want to revisit them and learn how to use them properly though, because I think they can be really useful. I found out about them thanks to a comment on one of my previous videos, and I just wanted to say thank you, and sorry I couldn't put it to good use yet. The help is still very appreciated though. Later, I made some changes to the player controller again, this time having the player face the direction of the mouse relative to its position instead of having the player face the direction of movement. Nuclear Throne does it this way, and I think it makes much more sense considering the fact that you're attacking in the direction you're looking. I also added arms for the player to hold a weapon, and I made them follow the mouse. Then, because Flip H only affects the sprite it's called on, I also made a body node and put all the sprites that I need to flip in there, so that when I switch directions, I can just scale that node to -1 and it will flip all the sprites together. At this point, I'd started ravenously devouring basically anything I could find about Godot, and in the process discovered the class name keyword, which, as simple as it seems, really helped me get more comfortable with GDScript. For those who don't know, giving a script a class name allows you to make it a type, which is something you can use to have Godot expect a certain set of attributes like variables and functions to be attached to it. That, as I learned thanks to this very detailed commenter, allows me to have code completion in the editor. This helps me because I can see what I can call in other objects and can also confirm that everything is hooked up right. This was a watershed moment for me. I immediately began to feel more comfortable with GDScript and my code is getting less terrible now. There's still a lot of growing and learning that I do in this episode, and that I still have to do now, but with this knowledge, I feel more competent. At the end of the last episode, I had these generic creatures represented by balls. I figured I'd ease myself into working on this episode by creating a different sprite for them. No, I'm just kidding. I actually finally started making good progress at this point. Although a lot of it is still undoing things that I'd done before, but just didn't touch on. So for me, it still felt like I was living the same day over and over and over again. With a few more tweaks, the weapons and weapon sockets were finally set up in a way that was kind of acceptable, and now I needed to address the way that the creatures were set up. Before being able to create a bunch of different creatures, I needed to have the base version set up correctly. Fortunately for me, I discovered a really good tutorial describing the composition approach to project architecture. Instead of using an inherited script for creatures and players, I can instead create components with scripts attached that can reference other components and work with each other. As you recall, I basically stumbled upon this method with my weapon sockets but didn't know what it was called at the time. Using this tutorial, I made a hitbox component and a health component. When the hitbox component is, well, hit, it will call a damage function in the health component, which will subtract the damage value of the weapon we pass to it from the health pool. If it's equal or less than 0, it will destroy its base node. That's almost disgustingly simple, but it lets me just drop these in whatever object I want, and it will function, so I could add the script to a door, or a box, or really anything. Now, for those of you who know Unity, this approach might sound sort of familiar, because it's basically exactly how Unity works. You add components that have certain fields and behaviors that are not tied to a specific object, but rather impart their features to their parent object. This is a great approach for me, and I intend to use this for more things if I can, since it's so familiar to me. You'd think with the new awesome system that I've found, that it would be smooth sailing from now on. Unfortunately not. Upgrading the weapon system to use the components was a nightmare, because as it turns out, the way I was handling damage before, well, wasn't very good at all, actually. Fortunately, I eventually got it worked out, and the system will probably still need polishing, but is a lot better now. Okay, now for the coolest thing in this episode. I learned about and then implemented something called a finite state machine. What's a finite state machine, I hear you ask? Well, it's an abstract machine that can be in exactly one of a finite number of states at any given time. Just like how a coin-operated turnstile can either be locked or unlocked based on whether or not you've given it a coin, a finite state machine has an initial state, a list of other states it can be in, all described by scripts that detail their behavior, and then conditions by which you can change the states. In my case, and so far, I have two states that a creature can be in, either wandering or following. Its initial state is wander, and when a player is detected, it will switch to the follow state where it will chase the player as long as the player is within its detection area. If the player leaves that area, then it reverts to wandering. Obviously, I have plans to expand this later with a flee and a stun state and probably some other ones as I think of them for different creatures. But this is a much simpler way to add and handle AI behaviors than the one I was doing before, which I won't go into but was basically just a series of conditional checks. Yuck. Now that I had a crazy cool new state machine and components to make use of, the final thing I wanted to do was to add knockback on hits. I found a tutorial for handling knockback with character body 2D objects, but I had to do a lot of modification, because I was trying to apply the knockback from the hitbox component, which was not how the tutorial was doing it. Unfortunately, it wasn't as straightforward as I would have hoped, because I ended up needing to add a vector 2 to both the player controller and the creature scripts that I could update from hitbox, and then apply in the physics process function. This was the best way I could think of to do it right now. Maybe I can have a cleaner method later, but I at least made sure to check if the object has a knockback field, so if it doesn't, it won't break anything. Okay, that's it. That's all I got done. It's a lot, but also not a lot, and it felt like I just kept doing the same thing over and over again. I'm so sorry that this episode has taken so long too. It seems like nothing about it was really as easy as I would have hoped, and I'm not even sure this will be a fun episode to watch. But that's just how it is sometimes. Unfortunately, stuff like this is just some of the most boring, but important parts of game development. I have to spend days thinking about how my game architecture would handle me wanting to have rats that can shoot flames, or crabs with knives, and since I'm so inexperienced with Godot, I end up having to rewrite and redesign constantly. I hope it was still kind of enjoyable and not too infuriating or boring. Hopefully the next episode will see more progress. In other news, I posted another Chimes long play. This time with a better ambience. I don't know why I picked a cave for the first one. This one has a thunderstorm going on and it's a lot cooler. If you check it out and like it, you can make your own configurations with the Real Chimes app, available on both app stores. There's a new update as well, and there's a new ambience in that update. And also, there's some new default presets in that update. And also, there's a bunch of new palettes for you to play around with. So if that interests you, please check it out. It would help me out a lot. Okay, that's all for now. Please like the video if you did, subscribe if you want more, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye.